Welcome to the Pelvic Health Podcast with Anthony Lowe, the physio detective, and Laurie Forner, the physio down there. Together we interview leading physiotherapists devoted to women's and men's pelvic health, answer your questions, and share our thoughts. Remember our disclaimer. The materials and content within this podcast are intended as general information and for entertainment purposes only, and are not to be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Now, grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and enjoy the show.
Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 9. Episode 8 was part 1 with Susan Clinton, so we're going to continue that episode. This is part 2 with Susan Clinton, and we'll just go back to the question that Anthony left off with. Enjoy.
That's the trigeminal alarm system, right? Mm-hmm. How does that, because, it's very interesting what you're talking about, love it, but for the women's health physios, how does that affect the bladder and the bowel, how does something so far away, and the vagus nerve being so far away, how does that affect the pelvis going back?
And I think that's an excellent question, because we do need to look at the far-reaching effects. And one of the things that system does, when we bring a system on that ramps up our sympathetic nervous system, there's 2 ways that it affects down into the pelvis. One of them is vascular, because when we're in a heightened sense or a sympathetic type, stress system, that affects the vascularity of everything that's going to muscles that aren't quite that important. So it may be that the pelvic floor will hype up and get really tight because it's getting good blood flow. It's getting some excitement because the whole postural control system is getting that excitement. But the lower bowel and the bladder are not. We're going to do one of 2 things. We're either, before an emergency, we're either going to cut it off and suck the stool back up because there's no time to have a bowel movement, or we're going to dump and run, right? Everything comes out. Boom, out comes urine. Boom, out comes the stool, and kaboom, there goes the person running like a crazy person. But you see that a lot.
Well, the sympathetic
right.
system
And so
has
you see
to do
that,
with the
though.
storage
Watch
of the
little
bladder.
kids who get afraid. What happens to them when they get mortally afraid? They pee all over themselves. I mean, it's the first thing. In fact, you can always tell, when a child is under, I think they're using that a lot when children are really under distress and they're afraid and they don't know how to talk about it. If that trigger comes in the room, that's one of the things that happens is they just, they pee. So, so that's how that happens. So maybe urgency frequency gets ramped up with the system because we've got this idea that every time we're upset or we're stressed, we have to run to the bathroom. And maybe just the idea of getting up and moving is enough stress to that system that is, now I have to pee and I can't hold it, because it's that neurologically driven thing, that behavioral kind of thing that we talk about, rather than a muscle control thing. It overrides the muscle and just the bladder will just do its cranky thing. So when we get that system in trouble from way up high, it really begins to govern what's happening there, because we're not able to really get the muscles to relax well enough to maybe pee completely or poop completely. Or maybe we run into a system because the vagus nerve is getting so messed up too, or the vagus system, because of all the changes in hormones and cortisol and everything that comes squirting out with stress, really begins to change the quality of the stool, that we're not able to, it's so hard, we can't drag it through, or it's just coming in clumps, or it's just turning into, a really soft, loose, liquidy kind of stool. And that's how we're dealing with it. So that's how that system works. Where it really becomes an issue for people, I don't think the trigeminal system just turns on by itself all the time. I think sometimes there has to be a driver to it. And I think where we start getting the drivers into that to start sensitizing that trigeminal system is everyday life, particularly in Western society. And the first thing is motor vehicle accidents. That little whiplash can have profound effects, especially if there is fear and stress and, oh my God, my new car, and now I'm not going to make it to my job interview, and all the other pieces that go with it, or that's just totally screwed my life now. Now I have to stop and deal with this car. Motor vehicle accidents are a huge thing. They are, even fender benders. And the other piece of it is falls. How many times in our life are we going to fall? Everyone's going to fall. That's just the way it is. We're on planet Earth with gravity. We're not going to get out of this without falling down. Some people more than others, unfortunately, depending upon kind of circumstances and things like that. So people can, have a pretty good fall and not realize the implications, from the cervicothoracic up, they just kind of deal with the lumbar, I fell on my butt, so now I got an SI, coccyx pain, hip, ischial tuberosity, those kinds of things. And they don't consider that, wow, there may have been, maybe even almost so much compression in the thoracic spine that those muscles are just splinting so hard, and they never learned to turn off, because then everything thought this is just where we have to live, and so we have to just kind of figure out, is that muscle guarding and holding, and now it's become true stiffness, or what's happened? But that begins to change everything up above, because we know there's that concussion syndrome that occurs with a fall, onto the pelvis, from the forces that get transmitted up. So that can mess up, part of that neurology up there, and really start kind of, I hate to use the word facilitation. I know, because people have such kind of funky things about it, but it just starts that hyperactivity, I guess, of that system. And perhaps it's something a lot of people can dampen, but there's always going to be those people that are going to, for whatever reason, set up to have that turn into something bigger, right? Because we're learning that with persistent pain, that there's some definite differences in neuroanatomy upstairs and how their brain fires, different from people who don't have persistent pain. And what they're trying to figure out is, does that happen? Is that difference in firing there before the incident ever occurred? Or, and how do you measure that? But I know they're looking at that, but there is definite differences in how the brain fires with patients with persistent pain versus patients who have had similar incidences but don't have that same firing pattern. So therefore they're not into that expression of pain. Interesting stuff. But that's why I ask all those questions about, if you had any falls, have you been in a car wreck, have you had things happen in your life? What kinds of catastrophes have happened? What kinds of things have happened to you? Tell me a little bit more about your life story, because that gives me a clue as to, do I need to start crawling upstairs with them and seeing, kind of how they're moving and what's going on up here? And maybe that's a better way into a system that's really, don't come near my pelvis. No, or don't come, yeah. Right. And so sometimes you can get up there, you can work with the breathing, you can kind of get them to learn to begin to lengthen that suboccipital area, by getting those muscles to eccentrically start to work a little bit. Maybe changing through there, being careful with their vestibular system, but then, you're getting some changes for them that maybe might be able to get into that loop and dampen that whole process.
The whole sympathetic parasympathetic thing is, I know we're talking about the vagus nerve. We were talking about the vagus nerve. That's parasympathetic, right? You're going to have to refresh me here. And parasympathetic for the bladder contracts the detrusor, right? And the sympathetic relaxes it. What were you saying about the bowel? Is it the opposite?
The bowel, you have to remember that it's a different type of system when we go back door. There's still the pelvic nerve and there's still the pudendal nerve, which are the primary, drivers, back there as far as neurology goes. But the bowel can be triggered by so many things up above because of all of the different reflexes that we have, starting at the pyloric reflex from the stomach. So when the pyloric reflex is stretched in the stomach, that triggers a gastrocolic reflex. And, it's just basically that thing like, hello down there, we got some stuff coming in, you better empty out below. So, we get, it's why people need to eat, if they're having problems with their bowels, they need to eat enough to stretch their stomach so that they can trigger that reflex and then go sit on the commode. That's often ways we train people with neurological injuries to plan and have bowel movements at the same time every day. We can capture those reflexes. So the bowel is a little bit more complex because we have several of those types of reflexes, even one that occurs with stretching of the rectum. But we have a little bit of a difference in the ability to turn that system off and retropulse the stool up under fire when we need to, much easier than the bladder. So oftentimes, because the bladder is full, the body will tend to choose to get rid of it and then move on rather than store, unless there's something really going on that's crazy with the bladder, and then we get into that store, and then we have to start looking for things like cauda equina and stuff like that, retention and not emptying fully, and other issues, or people who are just peeing only a little bit and then running away from the toilet, so learned behaviors as children. Does that make sense?
You've just tied forward head posture patterning into dysenergic
Yeah.
defecation in my brain.
And the
Really
other thing is, if
excited.
you think about people, this is another issue that all of our patients have as pelvic health therapists. We don't have patients with urinary problems that don't have some sort of bowel problem, right? I know people used to always say, Susan, just give the student the simple urinary incontinence patients. And I just started laughing going, when was the last time I had a simple, to me, it's just not simple. But, so we get constipation or bowel dysfunction, even if it's bloating, chronic smooth muscle activity, increases intra-abdominal pressure. And again, we don't need that intra-abdominal pressure increased all the time on an everyday basis. We need it right before bowel movement. We need it before we lift something. We need it, we need various degrees of it as we do things, but we don't need it to be up there and hanging up there all the time. So when we have people with constipation and they've got urinary frequency, we need to they got to deal with the constipation. We know that. We got to change those pressures. Yeah.
It's always bum first.
That system. And it's triggering that, that system all the way up and down. It's the same thing with people, how, unfortunately, in Western society, in Western cultures, how we eat. I mean, how many of us, sit tall and bring our fork and our spoon all the way up to our mouth? Really? No. We go down and we meet that spoon halfway, somewhere closer to the plate, right? And then start, even with sandwiches, we have lost that ability to stay upright to eat. It changes how we swallow. And you have to imagine if we're closing up right over that pyloric valve while we're eating, that's distending the esophagus too much. And that's triggering off that vagus nerve and causing all kinds of things to fire off that maybe shouldn't be firing off, because it should be saying, hey, let's all be relaxed. We've got nourishment coming in. This is a great thing. We're all on the rundown. Remember when, families used to sit down together to eat, and all the laughing and talking that went on. That's really what we should be doing, that evolutionary wise, food was a big deal. And, gathering as a group for a meal was that was it. Everybody looked forward to that.
I'm thinking if I was a caveman, I'd be wanting to scoff it as much as possible. I'd get my face right in there and let's go, people. Shovel it in.
My husband
Why would you? It slows you down.
It's gone in 2 seconds. And I'm just like, can you just pretend that you want to breathe while you're eating so the kids learn to be a little bit slow? And they're really slow. And I'm like, you know what?
Mine are slow because they're reading novels. They take a bite and they read a novel because they don't want to go to bed. They don't want to be told to go to bed. But I'm doing my reading.
I'm calming my system down.
They're going to start pulling it all out. So, look, all this pressure, you were talking about the digestive issues causing increased intra-abdominal pressure. You're talking about the sympathetic, the parasympathetic. How does all this affect things like pelvic organ prolapse and research into pelvic organ prolapse? And, what do you think of, are they actually looking at enough to see if there are changes in intra-abdominal pressure? Is the scope broad enough? Can we do the right research?
Actually, that's a great question. So where I went with this to start trying to figure out, because the question has always been, don't do sit-ups. But people need to get out of bed.
Amen.
Or they need to get off the floor. So I don't think sit-ups are evil, but I don't think we need to use that as a dominant exercise strategy.
Yes.
So I'll tell people, you can do some sit-ups, but I just don't want it to be the only thing you do. I want you to do a bunch of different things, right? So, but we need to be able to pull up and sit up and do those things. But so I started looking, and where I found some very cool literature is in the critical care journals of all things, back to my hospital roots. And there's some really very interesting research that they've looked at in that population, because a lot of these people have had profound surgeries, and many of them abdominal. They've had to really open up the pressure can and get at this stuff and do a lot of different things. And then they're having to deal with them in ICU, and vascular perfusion is huge. And all of these people have a urinary catheter. And they figured out that the pressure inside the bladder is the same as the intra-abdominal pressure, that it mimics each other. And so then they just were able to slide a little pressure monitor into the catheter to monitor the bladder pressure. And they put them in different positions, and they looked at the changes of pressure. And because one of the things, is always the big thing in ICU is what position do you put the person in that's going to maximize their recovery, but you can't leave them in one position all the time. And we've played around with things for the last 40 years in the States for sure, with beds that move every 2 minutes and beds that do this and air beds and water beds and all this kind of crazy stuff, trying to figure out how to get people the most comfortable. So one of the things that they found, which was quite interesting, was that the position that caused the most problems with abdominal perfusion, vascularity into the abdomen, was the semi-recumbent position in the bed where you're laying back and the head of the bed is up. And if you raise it to somewhere between 30 to 45 degrees, that's the worst. And so that was kind of interesting to me, because what that meant to me was not so much that you should never do a sit-up, because I'll get to that research here in a minute. But I think what's more dangerous is to sit on the couch slumped over, for a long period of time. Again, we need to slump. I've got to slump to put my shoes on. I'm not going to get my foot up to my knee, and I'm going to have to flex my spine. It's inevitable. I shouldn't be afraid of that. But the people who kind of, what I'm talking about, the people who like sit on their sacrums and prop up against the couch with the remote in their hand and the forward jaw, kind of look. We've got some problems there when people are using those as dominant strategies. And so I can, talk to them about that and say, when you're in these positions for a long period of time, this isn't healthy for your gut, and it's not healthy for your pelvic floor, because you're going to be more constipated. You're going to have more bloating in situations like that, because we're not getting good blood flow. We know that from the literature. That's going to affect the pressures down on your pelvic floor. So if they have pain, or if they have constipation, or if they have prolapse, so it makes me kind of look at people a little bit differently when they're like walking on the treadmill. Are they walking kind of all hunched over on the treadmill? Or are they kind of trying, are they using a different posture? Are they trying to kind of come upright a little bit? Are they, swinging their arms some? Are they, rotating their trunk? Are they looking around with their head, which nobody ever does?
No, you fall over that way.
Because we don't know how to do it, right? If we knew how to do it, if we spent more time walking and turning our head, we might be able to actually do that on the treadmill, but we never do that.
On the treadmill is a bit artificial, though. I'll turn my head when I'm walking on land, but on a treadmill, oh my goodness, I've nearly been those gym meme, accident videos.
Yes. But then perhaps start doing an up and down strategy, because people stare up at a TV, and I think that's just as dangerous as turning your head. Because you get into what you're watching, or you get into your book and you're not mindful of your body. But anyway, that's another whole story.
Sounds like we've got lots of topics to talk about.
But anyway, the point is that when we're talking about prolapse and, too much pressure down onto the pelvic floor, into the endopelvic fascia, which, can be problematic for some people, we have to consider that there are some people who just have cruddy connective tissue. Where, connective tissue in humans is on a spectrum, right? We've got people who have very loose, lax, whatever, Gumby type bodies. And then we have the fire hydrants way over here. And, so some people are going to just, because of either they have autoimmune stuff, or they've got, they had to use steroids a lot as a kid because they had asthma, or, whatever is going on, they may just have, kind of funky connective tissue that's just going to fail, whether they have great intra-abdominal pressure or not. Sometimes, unfortunately, that's what happens. But for the many people, one of the things we can do is really begin to get them to understand what will change those pressures. So looking at that critical care literature was really eye-opening for me in some respects about the chronic kind of holding postures. But there's been some other articles that have been written and compared intra-abdominal pressures to a lot of different things. And one of the things that actually increases the pressure the most is not the sit-up, it's stair climbing. And
getting out of a low chair.
We have to climb stairs. We all have houses with stairs. We all have things like that. So to me, it's not really, there's an evil exercise out there. I think it's how we actually get people to engage in that exercise. So I played a game with myself because I was having some problems about 3 years ago. And I realized that I was holding my breath like a crazy person climbing the stairs. Of course, I'm one of these people that I'm going to take everything out of the car and carry it all at once, and I'm not going to go back down to, because I always hear that you lift something heavy every day. Okay, here it is, But I wasn't able to like breathe on the stairs. I'm holding my breath and then stopping to breathe and then going. It's, oh, for God's sake. So I started playing a game when I come home, and if my husband's home, I'll start at the bottom of the stairs and I just play this game like, do you know where I am? Where are you? So I start talking, and I've been able to change the way I breathe and the way I go up and down the stairs because of that, because I could hear it in my voice when I was struggling. And I've changed the pressures, my intra-abdominal pressures going up and down the stairs, and I have more strength and power because I'm not wasting it all on trying to hold my breath. I'm actually now able to kind of, disperse those tensions and stuff through my limbs and really climb those stairs a lot easier. Plus, it's put me in probably a little different alignment and different postural strategy. And now the stairs are actually becoming my friend. There was a time when it'd be like, I don't want to go all the way upstairs and get that again. And now it's just whoop, up the stairs I go, which is really very cool, because most people will say when you're in your 50s, you're not going to get any stronger. You're not going to get any better. It's,
That's a lie. No. That's a lie.
We can all change. We can all change. So I used to be like this anti sit-up person, but I'm not anymore, because I really think that if we teach people to, now if they're having to crazy hold their breath, and they're having to over-recruit everything because they can't do it, then you've got to modify that sit-up position for them so that they can begin to eventually learn to go into eccentric and concentric and do it smoothly with controlling great pelvic floor and, and not breath holding and not a forward head and, just change some of the, or maybe not their shoulders all hiked up, and I think that's the problem that we have in the States for sure, is that if I can't do it like that video, then I don't want to do it at all. And we're just like, there's so much shame in do it halfway from this position because this is an excellent exercise for you. And you really want to move to where you can actually do that because perhaps this is an activity that they need to do. They need to get on the floor and off the floor with their grandchildren. And they want to play and roll around. That means they've got to be able to do sit-ups, some sort, in order to, because they're not always going to roll over and push up from their hands and knees, quite frankly. Who wants to do that?
I had a physio tell me that she just wouldn't do lunges with pregnant women at all. And it's like, sometimes you need to do that. And like stairs are a form of lunges. And I showed her how I modified things and just a small step forward, a little bit of asymmetry, And she was like, what's that going to do? And it's like, it's a graded progression towards a more difficult exercise. You're setting them on the path towards winning. You got to rack up all your wins. You got to get all those wins so that you can keep positive and keep developing towards strength. It's good. Now,
one of the issues with pregnancy and lunges is it's vitally important that they do them because the pregnant population, I don't think people understand, are at a high risk for fall. And the way they fall is through their anterior posterior sway, not side to side like older people. It's forward back. And it's because we don't have great load transfer. Everything is changing in our body and the load transfer begins to go wonk-eye with them. And they've got to be able to do those lunges and step-ups and single leg stance and those movements because that's going to keep them upright and keep their.
All they do is go sideways. That's what I was mimicking. All they do is just go side to side, side to side.
It becomes that dominant strategy again. And although it's a short-term strategy when they're pregnant, many of them don't change out of it postpartum, right?
Absolutely.
It gets better, but they never really maybe get that nice transverse plane rotation coming back again. Because now what? They're stuck up here with the baby up here and up next to their shoulders and their cervicothoracic because the baby's near the heart and that's where we want to hold and that's lovely and it's so wonderful. And so they are still stuck up here. And so they never had the opportunity to change below. And then all that pressure down on that poor area that has just gone through the trauma, of birth, it really kind of, we're putting a lot of pressure down low. So that's why those
lateral shifting as well. Then we put it asymmetrically through a lateral shift. We close down one with a head forwards because you're looking at the baby and watching the baby feed, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
What's latching again?
What do I do now?
and then we squash the container and, I'm not even sure, like I know the women's health people do, the internal examiners do, but like I think a lot of musculoskeletal physios forget that the transversus abdominis and multifidus and the pelvic floor and even the diaphragm, they all have unilateral parts, and they all can be different in their activations. Everyone keeps thinking bilateral, and no, these things don't work bilaterally. They can, but quite often they're not. We've got to train all the movements. Like you said, like people always say to me, oh, which type of squat should I do? And it's like, all of them. I want you to do all of them. So
right. I don't want you to be stuck in one position, one posture. I don't want that to be your motor plan. I want you to have many different motor plans, and it's challenging to do that, but it works really well. The whole idea about having a baby and holding up here and watching, it'd be really nice to film some postpartum moms on that and show the differences when they're holding them, when they're not. One of the things that I did was one of my passions in life is dance. It always has been from when I was young, and music. And my dance of choice these days is I'm ballroom dancing with my husband. We're taking lessons, which is hilarious. It's as good as marriage counseling. It's just the whole communication thing is very different when you're doing this ballroom. But I line dance. I love country western music, and so I'm a big line dancer. And I took a couple of the ladies who instruct, and I just kind of did this for a video that I'm going to use in my next course. And I actually took McConnell taping, that really hard, rigid tape, and I taped them as hard as I could into a forward head posture.
Wow.
So that they couldn't move out of it. And I taped them moving before, and I taped them moving after. And the stumbles and the change in how they're breathing and their complaints of fatigue and
their broken noses when they fell forwards.
So it was, but when people talk about that can't make that big of a difference, it's like just that can make a huge difference. But see, I learned that with neuro. Some of those over recruitment patterns with CVAs, if you tape up somebody's, iliopsoas, and what am I trying to say? The quadratus muscle in the back, like really pull the ribs down to the hip and really tape that hard across, the diagonal. We did this in PT school to demonstrate what those postures look like and how people moved, and have them move. And you would see the arm falls down. They quit using their arm. Their head goes over, and then they have to bring it up so it looks at the horizon. And they were walking like with a hemiplegic gait. There was nothing wrong with that student's brain. All we did was change and mimic an over recruitment of a muscle. It can have profound effects all the way up and down.
Then this is where I get confused when Anthony was talking about the research. They've been doing research on intra-abdominal pressure and exercise, and the latest stuff they've been doing, I think out of Ohio, Shaw and Nygaard, they've been using that wireless intravaginal transducer to look at different movements and stairs and holding babies and walking. Mm-hmm. But are they looking at, there's nothing cited within the papers that I've read about their alignment, their head positioning, how they're breathing. Right. So is the research, what is it telling us anything?
Are we missing things?
I think it's beginning to tell us something, because we have to, in research, one of the things you have to do, and I've learned this through people way smarter than I am about research and telling me all the time. And, Sandy and Sarah have shared this with me thousands of times. You got to keep this question very simple in the beginning. You have to. And so I think that's the beginning, is we've got to at least just get those things. And then maybe can we change it if we do this or do this? But first we have to know what's there.
And their big thing was that it was individual, that people could do some things and have an increase in pressure and other people's didn't. And so then I guess
we have to kind of figure out why, right? I know Hodges and his group are using force plates and looking at some different things with pressures. Mainly, I think this is being driven, if I'm not mistaken, by the work that they're looking at in Nepal, where the women are carrying, it's crazy how much they have a head strap and they carry all of the stuff on their back. And the incidence of pelvic organ prolapse in Nepal is staggering, and to the point that the women are excluded from the community once it occurs, And so they're really, and they're trying to figure out, how do we teach, how do we change, what's sustainable change in Nepal, that culture and everything. And I know there's a couple of therapists, Karen Brandon's group, or one of the people she has been mentoring for a while. She can probably give you more information on that. because
Tomorrow morning.
That's
yeah,
tomorrow
tell her
morning.
I said hello. But anyway,
8
so
hours.
there's some cool stuff that we're looking at. Is it enough? Is it ever enough? I think it's a beginning. And I think that, we just need to keep kind of pushing the envelope and keep asking ourselves questions. How much more? Where are we going? Is it we're making changes, but is it for the reasons that we think? That's where we begin that kind of myth busting. It's hard because with PTs, we decide that I know it, I understand it, I can buy into this, this is really good. And then you find out that, oh, it wasn't because of that, it's because of this. That doesn't mean that you're a bad PT or you shouldn't be doing it. It just means that we're learning all the time and we need to be open to that. And I think that's where we can have a whole lot more fun.
Oh, yes. I love having fun with myth busting.
Please tell me you're going to do some online courses, Susan.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah. It's
Will they be available for international
Of course.
people as well?
Yes. Definitely.
Oh my god, this has just been like a little free
I
course.
reckon.
Oh, I like doing this.
Why don't we relate all this pressure talk to DRA? Tell us about DRA and tell us what you think. How do you control that pressure? Are you a focus on the gap girl, or are you focused on the tension girl, or how do you think of DRA and the pressure canister? Diastasis rectus abdominis, that is.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought it up because when you were talking about pregnancy, one of the things that I like to do with pregnant women is get them on all fours or leaning over a countertop so that their abdomen is suspended, in a descended position, because as our muscles lengthen, we actually build sarcomeres, in parallel, right? One after another, because as the muscle lengthens over time. And in pregnancy, we can't do it fast enough because although for the woman, the 9 months can seem like 10 years, it really is quite a rapid event, so getting them in that position. And a lot of people will say, oh, you should never, ever do that. It's way too much pressure. It'll cause DRAs and all kinds of things to happen. But I think that's the only way you can get the muscles to have those sliding filaments begin to kind of work. And you can teach them to concentrically and eccentrically, contract in those postures, which is really very important. And then you can bring them upright and teach it and into all the different things. So they begin to learn to, keep those muscles working as they're changing. With that said, we have a baby and it's like popping the balloon, it's sudden, boom, the balloon is popped and everything goes whoosh. And there we are. So now you're dealing with this system that's gone from very high pressure to completely nothing. And those muscles have no idea how to work. The nervous system has no idea how to put it back together. And so I think that, my coming from that background and that thought, and knowing that we have to stand up on planet Earth and work on planet Earth, I tend to be more about how do you develop the tensions through the system, with the caveat that following pregnancy, I think it's a good idea to have some actual compression so that you can support the tissue while it's in its acute and early subacute phases of healing. So follow that line of physiology and tissue physiology, and it makes a lot more sense to me. So I've got a system that all of a sudden has, changed dramatically, and I may have the floor of that system in a little bit of trouble. Either they had an episiotomy, maybe they tore, they got overstretched, things are different. There's a lot of, things happening with the uterus and discharging, and there's still a lot of things going on, and we're still breastfeeding. So there's connective tissues that are not changing as fast as if we weren't. And I think that we need to support that system. And I hate to see people not go through that. I think that you need to support from underneath. And I think you don't have to use crazy abdominal binders and all this stuff where people can't move and breathe, but you need to have adequate support for the area so it can begin to heal. And they need to move. All this whole stuff about you can't do anything with anybody till they're 6 weeks out. And it's, what the devil are they going to do for 6 weeks? Sit on the floor and just breastfeed and have people hand them stuff? No, they're getting in and out of bed. They're rolling in and out of bed. They're standing up. They're leaning over. They've got
to go to the toilet.
They're taking care of a
Right.
toddler.
Their kids
They're
are
taking care of
jumping
their
on
other
them, and people
children.
didn't think that, pregnancy was that no contact sports in pregnancy. It's like having a family is a contact sport. I mean, kids are going to jump and pull, and it's just the way it is. And it's crazy for us not to look at that. We need to help people into function as much as possible. So I think using the breathing and using, beginning to get them again to where they can get those muscles to where they can get into that position where they can actually start to work them is very important. So I like to get them, either sideline or on all fours as quick as I can so that we can start recruiting those muscles adequately, because laying flat on their back, if those muscles are used to being way out here and now all of a sudden we lay them flat on their back and everything just kind of smooshes together, there's no way they can generate any kind of a contraction or activation pattern that's going to be meaningful to them. It's just not going to happen early on. You want to get them there, but they need to get into some different positions. They need to get used to letting their belly hang a little bit and then begin to start developing, through that tension system, that the ability of those muscles to begin to work. And I think that's, and again, some of these ladies they don't pull themselves up from their back ever. They come in with this, and trust me, I've seen many of them 3 years, 4 years out, and they're still rolling over to get up. They will never I have them on their back. It's okay. Lift your head and shoulders up. Oh, I should never do that. Really? Then I want to really kind of start to ask, and hopefully this is okay. It's like, how do you have sex? I mean, what position do you get in?
You
Yeah,
do
you get into it at all? Because holy cow. Anyway, there's just reasons to be able to do this stuff, and it just makes me sad that people are being told to not do things, because our patients hear that, and they put it in their brain like it's cement. They really do, and they get very afraid of it. And I hate to see that, because then they're not really giving themselves the richness of movement that they need to really, as you want to say, Anthony, close the gap. So I'm a bit of a gap girl, but I really like the tension system. And I just really believe that the body, and it's an unfortunate word that we've used for tension instead of hyperactivity or other things. People, oh, you're too tense. Actually, I think the human body is kind of a closed system, and it works under tension. And we need to have tension. We have to have it in order to work well. It's when we fall into compression that we get into trouble. So when we get a big scar, from an injury and stuff, we may begin to move differently around that scar. That starts some compressive activities into tissues that really aren't designed to function that way. And over time, it could be problematic. Maybe not, maybe so. But I think that if we can get people, tension systems working a lot better and get them understanding that, we don't want to just sit all crunched. We want to grow tall. And then from that, we want to move, and we want to do some things rather than being crunched and then trying to move. We can get a better richness of movement if we actually begin to access that tension system and get that thing going again. And that's where I think brings that issue in for the DRA a little bit better. And of course, swallowing, breathing.
CDs. Sandy talked about the Franklin exercises. I've never heard about. I'd heard about it when I was teaching Pilates a long time ago, but it's something that I've been meaning to look into a little bit more with the cueing, and it sounds like it's all about fluid movement.
Yeah,
and
there's all kinds of, the world is your oyster when it comes to this stuff. And I encourage people to play around, because visualization, we've got grade 1 evidence that visualization can change the movement system. We've had that for a long time. We've had that back in the days when they were starting with sports psychology, and real time, visualizing the movement and the game plan and the whole thing. And what are you going to do if you trip? And, we really know that all of that stuff works. And why don't we use that for other things? I'll get them. What does it for you? What can you visualize when you're breathing? What can you visualize when you're moving? What do you visualize when I ask you to come tall and you feel that? What, give me a metaphor for you to use, because it needs to be person specific. I can give them some to kind of think about, but I want them to come up with their own, because it's their brain. And those things are fun, because it begins to help them begin to see, that they can move and change, and they can use visual and colors and things to do it. And that may speak to people a whole lot more than anatomy and physiology and don't do this and breathe like this and, step like this and all of that stuff. Anthony said, I want you to squat every way you can squat. I don't want you to just squat one way. What works for you? Let me see you do it. Let's start with that, and then let's get you, have you thought about doing it this way before? Let's try it, and it's the same thing with people that are older. Have you thought about getting on the floor? No, I haven't done that in forever. Let's go halfway. Let's figure out how to get you on your hands and knees, perhaps, to do, to get things out from under the bed. Let's figure some of this stuff out and give them that ability to get that confidence back again.
Now, I wanted to ask you one more thing, but I'm so aware that we've just stolen so much of your time. But geez, you're a good talker, and I just love this information. Are
Thanks.
you all right? Do you have another 5 minutes?
Can we keep asking?
Yeah.
I did. Now, we don't have to talk about it, but I wasn't sure if you had an opinion or any kind of information you wanted to share, or if you've been looking. I know there's a lot of controversy and questions about the hyperpressive exercises and how that fits into.
Somehow in the back of my mind, I knew you were going to ask this because everybody does ask me. It's actually interesting because Nikki Caputo from England has just reached out to me and wants to have some conversations. And I told her I would welcome that because I absolutely, and I'll just go right out here and say it, I absolutely have no idea how hypopressives work or what it's all about. So I'm not going to speak for or against it because I just have no knowledge on it. So stay tuned. Maybe as I learn more, I want to approach anything with the idea that, what made that person come up with that idea or those people or that group, because there's got to be something to it, and I think, so I'm interested in kind of trying to understand a little bit more. The only little bit I can say about it, and I'll probably get myself in trouble with everybody who's a hyperpressive person out there, it's got to do something with training inhalation or exhalation at certain levels. That's the only thing I can think of from what I've read and seen. And again, I'm not going to say more than that because I don't know.
I think that seems to be the consensus with everybody, is that we don't understand it enough. So it will be really interesting when somebody figures it out, and we can do a whole podcast on that.
Give me a little time. Yeah, I was going to say, maybe you guys can reach out to Nikki in England and see if she wants to come on, and she chimes in on the Women's Physiotherapy Facebook page.
Just to tie the whole thing together, do you have any breathing tips or exercises or coordination points that your women's health physios, people who are listening to this podcast, to consider? Because, Julie Wiebe talks about, the piston, the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to add, or do you have a different take? I talk about the 3D breathing and the umbrella and stuff like that. Other people talk about a tent going up and down. What's some of your beautiful imagery that you use, or cueing, or any tips or things to look out for?
So the first thing that I do is I look for the dominant pattern that they have, because again, there are times for abdominal breathing, and there are times for chest breathing, and there's times for upper chest breathing, shallow breathing. And we need to be able to do all of those things. But what I don't want to have is one pattern being that, one way being their dominant way. And most of the time what I see is a lot of dominant abdominal breathing. So I'll just pick on that, but knowing that there's a lot of other people out there that do the other way. And I never tell people not to use their abdomens, because I might as well be speaking a foreign language to them at that point, because they're like, I've done this and I've done this, and this is how I breathe. And that's great. All we're going to do is just get your lungs involved, because your lungs need to be kind of part of this action package, because if we don't fill those up, we're not going to get, you're working too hard down here because we're not getting enough happening up here. And so basically we just start very easy and very slow, and they can do it in a chair. I teach them to do it in all different kinds of positions, because it's a wonderful way to take 2 minutes out of your day and go, jet down, relax. Let's try this again. So, and one hand on the tummy and one hand on the chest. And I just tell them, I just want that to even out. I don't give them a whole bunch of explanation and crazy stuff. I want to see what their central nervous system will sort out and how they'll figure that out. And I'll tell them that it's very normal to feel breathless. It's very normal after you do this for a little bit to just have to take a deep breath in. Go ahead. It's just your system resetting itself. And all I'm doing is just having them get that way. Then once we kind of get those changes, Then I'll start with them on maybe using some of the piston breath that Julie uses if I need a little of that resistant exhalation to kind of bring that deeper pressure system on a little bit for some movement. Or I'll teach them that, if we're trying to really get some nice, lower thoracic excursion, then I'll use the umbrella. I don't like tent. That doesn't work for me. But I use the umbrella or the idea, most people remember the salons where you have the hair dryer. That's how the diaphragm's actually shaped, because the back of the hair dryer that holds up the hood is what's attached to the spine. And then you've got this hood piece that comes out, and that hood piece comes up and down. But this part also moves too. So they get this whole back, so they get the understanding that everything's involved. And, so when they're taking deeper breaths and they're doing things, I'll ask them to, kind of visualize that a little bit more, and whether they want to visualize it by that moving. Sometimes people do really good visualizing air balloons in their chest and just filling up those air balloons. And that works. But the biggest key for me, besides all of that, is people can't hear themselves breathe. So I actually ask them to talk, and we talk a lot. And they talk when they move. They talk when they get in and out of chairs. I have them tell stories. If they can't think of anything to say, I'll tell me the name of every friend you've ever had since first grade. I give them count to 25. It can be that simple. But they can hear the change in their voice. And so I'll cue them into, do you hear how high your voice is getting with this? Or do you hear how breathy you're getting? Or do you hear how you quit talking for the last minute? And because that's something they can tune into, and it helps them get that online a little bit better. So we can modulate how much pressure they're using by thinking about how much they're talking, because sometimes they forget to blow through the straw, or sometimes they forget to do these things. But if I get them in the habit of playing these little voice games, it's something they can do all the time. And even, most of the time people will do that in and out of the shower, in and out of bed, up and off the commode, in and out of the car. You don't have to do it at the restaurant when 16 people are looking at you, but to just kind of make it a little bit more real for them. And the reason I like that, again, they can hear that. And that becomes that self-modulating kind of thing, because that makes a lot more sense to them than if I'm breathing really good or not. And then there's the whole swallowing thing, and that's another whole topic. So, but one of the things I'll ask them to do is, can you swallow in that position? And can you swallow in this position? Which one feels better? Let's make them both work well for you, so that they have to begin to engage much more than just, and that brings the pelvic floor on, because It's all part of the system, I think.
Yeah, it just seems ridiculous to me that people would look at the pelvic floor in isolation. But, that's just a personal bugbear. Susan, it's been amazing. It's been like a private 2-hour tutorial for us. It's been fantastic listening to you talk. And to be honest, I feel a lot less lonely in the world, knowing that there's somebody out there who thinks in similar ways. And I really do wish we caught up in Chicago, because that would have been just awesome.
Yes, that would have been fun. I'm sorry I couldn't make that, but it'd been there.
I don't know. Some guy called Lauren was there. Come down here, run your course.
Well, like I said, my friend's down there. Maybe we could work something out.
Fantastic. Look, where can people find out more about you, and where can they find out about your services?
People can find out about me at www.embody-pt.com. That's my website. All of my contact information is on there, and my phone number. So give me a call, drop me an email, susan@embody-pt.com.
Fantastic. And you're on Facebook, you're on social media. That's fantastic. Look, thank you very much for being on the podcast. Really love having you as a guest. And, I dare say we'll have you back again, because it's been such a wonderful torrent of information. It's been fantastic. So thank you very much, and tune in again to the Pelvic Health Podcast. Thanks very much, Susan. Thanks very much, Laurie. See you later.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, be sure to ask them on this episode's page at physiodetective.com/Pelvic Health Podcast or at laurieforner.com. Thanks for listening, and please join us on the next episode of the Pelvic Health Podcast.